Welcome to the InfoMullet YouTube channel. If you enjoy this content, please like or share. And if you'd like to support the InfoMullet by becoming a mulleteer, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate your support. Let's get started with the third part in the series of the iceberg. So what the iceberg is, remember we started with, in the wake of the George Floyd protests, well, the murder of George Floyd I described as the tip of the iceberg when or Triana or Ahmaud Arbery, any of these individuals get killed by the police, the protests erupt, sometimes there's riots, there's all these things, and it's really just those deaths are just the tip of an iceberg of grievance, and most of that iceberg lays beneath the surface. So what I've been doing in the last 3 weeks is trying to expose that iceberg piece by piece by piece. So the first one was showing how a disparate amount of police encounters generated the disparate outcomes and lethality of interactions with police for Blacks and Hispanics and Native Americans. So that was the first part of the iceberg. Then I showed last week how if you go deeper down that iceberg, what you find is that driving those police interactions is not violence and crime or law and order. It was, using the case study of Ferguson, it's a municipal fine collection machine. I showed how the municipal court used nonviolent violations of what amount to municipal code, almost like homeowners association gone wild, but then they used the police as the debt collector for these violations. And I showed, and again, these links are in all the links for this section are in the comments, and at the YouTube you can see these videos from past time. But I showed how a vast majority of these offenses weren't even worthy of jail time when they're made. They're simple fines, but the failure to appear, the failure to pay a fine, those would get added, and those were then arrestable offenses and could kick a failure to remove trash violation up to a felony offense. Well, today I'm going to go down to the third part, which is even deeper in the iceberg, and it's now we're starting to get very broad, and we're leaving the law enforcement and court area to talk about more. When we use the phrase systemic disparity, I think a lot of people hear that, but don't quite internalize what that means in terms of systemic disparity means system-wide, right? So we have, a lot of times people are like, well, this thing in our past history was used for racism, and that's bad for this thing. I'm going to tell you, everything that exists in America at one point or another was leveraged to advance racism or slavery or white supremacy or whatever you want to say, because that's what systemic disparity means. It means system-wide. And what I wanted to do today is show a much broader look at the grievance, the iceberg here beneath the surface that goes far deeper than just the police interactions, but it ties into what we've been talking about as we've gone down this iceberg beneath the surface to look at, and I'll hopefully be able to make some of those connections. So as I go through this, of course, if you have questions, ask them. I'll try and get back to them before we head on to the next segments. But what I wanted to do first is talk about this systemic disparity. It doesn't take hard to find. And what I'm doing today is I picked 3 things that I want to look at to show this systemic disparity in action. But kind of the challenge I'm going to get to, what I'm calling Lydia's challenge, is that you can do this on your own. These systemic disparities exist in almost any factor or metric or social welfare measure you want to look at. And my challenge is to people to start looking at those and finding where these systemic disparity exists. But I wanted to show 2 in particular. So hopefully this is showing on the screen here. This is a very important thing in American life, obviously, is where you fall in the income. And this is a chart of household income. And I'll try and clear it because it's a busy chart. And I know there's a lot going on here, but this is the Census Bureau going back from 1972 to 2017 using 2018 constant dollars. And for those of you who are real data nerds like me with the Census Bureau, ACSE is removed. That means we're not counting as income health insurance and things like that. So this is just a straight up household income in 2018 dollars. And on the left side here, this is the lowest income per quintile. Now, quintiles means you take a population and you divide it in 5. And it's used in income to sort of segment the population of saying the lowest quintile, the first quintile is the people, the 20% of the population who make the lowest. The second quintile is the next, all the way up to the 5th quintile. And that's the ones who are the 20%. Now, these cutoff points are actually the lowest threshold to qualify for that quintile. And what I did is I laid, and the reason it's busy is I overlaid white household income quintiles with black household income quintiles. And this is an example where you don't have to look far to see this iceberg of systemic disparity. It exists everywhere. And so what this is on the top line here, this is the highest household income quintile for whites. And you can see it's pretty far above everything else. This is the fifth. This means at this level or above, the top 20% of earners. And this isn't really a chart of income inequality, but it serves two purposes in that it kind of represents income inequality in some ways, because you can see, and that's a whole nother topic, but you can see here that this has largely gone up over time, whereas most of the rest of them have stayed flat. And so this solid line is the highest income earners for whites by household. This solid line here is the highest income quintile for blacks. Well, right away, you can visually see that the difference between white and blacks, and this is a key point, because as I've done these icebergs, I get a lot of comments like, well, maybe the police are targeting, maybe this is just something in poor areas, these disparities exist. The disparities exist at all levels of society, and this one shows pretty clearly that the top quintile of white earnings is significantly different than the top quintile of black earnings, to the point that this dotted line here, this is the fourth quintile of white household earnings. And you can see we only crossed the threshold where the highest households of black earners crossed the second highest quintile only in 2007. So, and these records go back to 1960, 1950. I broke it out from 1972. But what it's showing here is at every level you go down a socioeconomic status thing like the quintiles, there's a disparity between the white experience and the black experience. And it gets worse the lower you go. So the highest quintile of black earners finally crossed the second highest, and they're still a long way from parity from the highest white. But if you look down here, this third line here, these are the third highest white quintile. And you can see that the second highest for blacks, the fourth quintile, is barely reaching up to the third. So the highest is not as high as the white and just only crossed the second highest. The black second highest only just met up with the third highest of the whites. And as you go down here, you see that these generally flat lines here, this is the second highest quintile for whites, and this bottom flat line is the lowest income quintile for whites. So these are household incomes. So this is the lowest quintile. And you can see here that the black quintiles of income by household are not even barely breaking through the first, let alone the second, for 1, 2, 3. So you've got almost 2 quintiles, 40% of the black population by households are earning less than the lowest quintile of the white households. And this is an example of what I'm referring to as systemic disparity. There's no argument that says, well, poor whites are worse off, are just as worse off than poor blacks. There's a clear difference in the quintiles and the amount of the population who falls within it. And this is an example. Now, why is this? This is a big question, but you can look back in my Coastline of Violence video. I described a lot of the policies in the 20th century. We're not even going to go back to slavery or far back like that. I think sometimes people jump back to slavery because it's obviously a problem, but they're missing key policies in the 20th century. Redlining, yellow lining, restrictive HOA covenants, using freeway demolition, demolish neighborhoods. All of these obviously the drug war, right? All of these practices have an accumulating effect over time that you can see mapped out in this income disparity. As businesses get demolished in favor of a highway, that's the loss of capital for that neighborhood. As communities get fragmented, the opportunities erode. And so you see this is more of a reflection, I think, of what happened in the last 50 years than as opposed to what happened in the last 100 years. And I think it's really important to understand that these policies were still going on in the 20th century, and in some cases even in the 21st century. The last case of redlining prosecuted by the Department of Justice was 2015. And how this disparity plays out in another way is when we look at life expectancy. So I think a lot of liberals would probably say, when it comes to income things, when you talk of the red and the blue divide, the blue is generally on top of income. They talk about it a lot. They're familiar with it. But when the blue side, the liberals talk about life expectancy, and you hear this all the time when talking about healthcare. There's a tendency to what I call whitewash the systemic disparity with Black suffering in favor of saying, well, our overall life expectancy is less than Norway, and that's bad. Well, the reason it's less than Norway is because of the racial divide we have in this country and the systemic disparity that exists in life expectancies between whites and blacks. So this next chart, again, you can do this on almost anything you want to pick. I picked 3 to look at today, but any broad indicator of social welfare, I'm kind of challenging as we get to the bottom of this iceberg to keep doing this on your own. Pick one, segment it by race, and take a look. This chart here is pulled from the CDC mortality trends, and then I picked up Norway data from a website because I needed it quick. But if you look on the left here, if it's life expectancy at birth, so these are the years you're expected to live at birth, from 1972 to 2017. And what I've done is segmented it now by race and gender because we know there's a significant difference between men and women of both races. And so this top red line is white women, this dash red line is white men, the full blue line is black women, and the dash blue line is black men. This brown line, this is Norway. We always like to compare ourselves to the Nordic countries. How are we doing against Norway? Well, that's Norway, right? And Norway is not segmented. It's all sexes, all races. There. But what you can see is, again, this disparity. The top line of white experiences with white women who live on average longer, and were even living on average longer than Norway than just recently when there was this crossover in 2012. But look at this, black women who we know women live longer than men, they're barely above the lower end of the white, which is the white men. And so you see again that the best that the blacks are doing with this kind of disparity is at or equal to, slightly below, slightly above the next or third highest category for the equivalent whites. And black men life expectancy is much lower, significantly lower. And this is where a lot of these life expectancy numbers, we say, well, our life expectancy isn't very good in this country. Let's obviously, there's healthcare and things like that they want to do. But those memes often fail to account that there's a huge racial divide driving that. That's the difference in if you looked at life expectancy between white men and white women compared to Europe, we compare pretty favorably. Where the discrepancy occurs is in Black, Hispanic, and Native American life expectancy. And that's part of that systemic iceberg that is I'm trying to get to, that this, when we talk about George Floyd and protests, we can go into the policing, we can go into the municipal courts, but all of these things have actions, and I'm going to get into felony disenfranchisement here in a bit. But I wanted to kind of go through this income inequality, because when we talk about, if you get arrested, that's going to have an impact on the jobs you're able to get for the rest of your life. Even if you have, you do your time, you exit society, anything you apply for as a job is going to ask, do you have a felony? Have you been convicted of a felony? And it also impacts community formation. And this is where, so a lot of the questions from the first two things, well, we're kind of asking about, do these effects also scale for when blacks are successful, high income earners? Do the police still? Yes, they do. Anywhere you look at it, if you take an equivalent white group and an equivalent black group, the black group will have higher disparity in policing, regardless of income, education status, whatever you're talking about. That disparity exists. And I just showed that even amongst income and life expectancies, there's a disparity. Another question that's come up is, why don't people just vote these folks out of office? And I talked briefly about this last week when I showed that the Ferguson voting was, for municipal elections, was actually, even though it was a majority black city, it was overwhelmingly, or during the off-cycle elections, which determined municipal, it tended to skew racially toward white, and why that is. And felony disenfranchisement, I mean, we can talk about voter suppression in a large amount of areas. There's a ton of research out there. I suggest people do it. But when it comes to something called felony disenfranchisement, this is a very specific thing that's relevant to Ferguson, because I showed in Ferguson that there were thousands of felonies being churned through this municipal court to collect fees and fines. But those felonies, they pull your driver's license, you have a probation period, and as long as you are still, under that probation period, you can't vote. And this problem is, someone has just mentioned a very good thing. anytime you have a felony, even if the felony is nonviolent, remember, many of these things where you failed to pick up your trash and you end up with a failed felony violation, you're still going to have a hard time getting a loan. You're going to have a hard time working for the government. You're going to have a hard time getting a job at a retail store. And how this felony disenfranchisement interacts with voting patterns is something the Sentencing Project takes a look at. So these next charts come from the Sentencing Project, and this is a look at the country overall. And it shows here how the felony disenfranchisement laws are today. Now, these links are in there if you want to follow and get them. So the light blue is there's no restriction. If you have a felony or you are convicted of a felony, you can still vote. And, you know, you can see those, there's really only Maine and a few states up here. Prison, obviously, if you're in prison, most states won't let you vote. Prison and parole. So this gets where you've done your prison time, you're now doing parole time, and you can see now that a lot of additional states, especially in the center of the country, have picked up. Prison, parole, and probation is even longer, and some of these states even have post-sentence, you know, you're basically disenfranchised for life. And you can see Missouri has, where Ferguson is located in, prison, parole, and probation. And these, what's interesting is if you've watched me at all talk about violence and criminal violence, you know that the general trend in the US is that violent crime is reducing. It's the lead hypothesis that leaded fuel in the 60s and 50s led to a surge of violence that occurred in the 70s and 80s. And this was worldwide. It's well studied. And that surge of violence, we tended to react with get tough on crime and stuff like that. Well, that surge abated in the mid to late 90s through the early 2000s, and the crime wave went down. So you would think the felony disenfranchisement would go down, right? That the rate of felony disenfranchisement would increase. But over time, it's actually increased. And this is because more laws at the federal level, more laws at the state level are being classified as felonies because it's easier to convict. You have more leverage if you're trying to exert a fine or intimidate someone. You can get them to agree to a Class D felony or something like that. But you can see here the rapidly increasing rate of disenfranchised felons. And, you know, in Ferguson specifically, when the Ferguson riots happened, they went out and actually asked almost immediately what was, you know, sort of what were some of the root causes of the grievance that were happening in Ferguson. And one of the links I have in there is they pointed immediately to this felon disenfranchisement. There were 6 people who were interviewed in one of these articles, and every single one, almost immediately, as a black man, said felon disenfranchisement. And there's a quote here where it says, if you're a student in one of the black schools here and you get into a fight, you'll probably get arrested and charged with assault. That's a felony assault. And that means that kids are gaining felonies that will prohibit them from voting before they're even old enough to register. And the effect this has on the community, it's not just the felons themselves that feel this impact. You know, a lot of people think of, well, okay, so there's how many felons are in Ferguson? We don't know exactly, but with Missouri, 7% of the black population are felons. And because of this kind of municipal fine churn. And people ask, well, what's the impact of that on the community? It's only 7% of the votes. But voting is a community activity. You learn to vote as a social construct, you know. So much of reality is a social construct, right? You learn to vote because your parents vote. You learn to vote because your friends are going to vote. You practice voting by talking and interacting in a political way. And so there's been some research in how these felony disenfranchisement laws affect the larger community. And the link to this research is in the article. And what it shows is that when you have strict felony disenfranchisement laws, that creates a additive effect where it's not just the felons who don't vote, the community as a whole has suppressed voting because the population that is voting is so much more drastically reduced. And they compared this effect to whites and blacks under both what are called loose felony disenfranchisement and strict. And so, here we go. This shows on the left is the probability of voting, and then the type of felony disenfranchisement law in states. So it's looking at non-lifetime states versus lifetime states, the severity of it. And you can see here the white non-Hispanic, the impact of strict felony disenfranchisement is limited as you go from a less strict to a more strict, but the impact on black communities is tremendous. It drops almost 12%, which means that you've got an 11 times effect in this sort of suppression. So even if you are only, say, disenfranchising 7% of the adult population, which is still a large part of the population, it's going to have a multiplier effect because that is disproportionately felt in the community and it erodes trust in the government. And you know why? Because I talked about it last week, why this difference is. The whites and the non-Hispanic whites in Ferguson were 6 times less likely to be charged with a municipal felony violation than the blacks. So the blacks say, hey, these felonies you're handing out to get revenue are not equally distributed based off percentage of the population or something like that. It's clearly being used to target our community. And because they can't vote, they can't drive, they can't get these things while they have the felony, and even during probation, it suppresses the turnout more than just the felons themselves. And so this argument about whether or not they can just always vote themselves out of these situations, I think is a tricky argument. And because, and let's just take a counterfactual. Let's assume that people are not always voting for their best self-interest. We can probably find some examples of that. As a radical moderate, it's pretty adamant to me that no state has a right to tyranny, right? What Ferguson was doing was inexcusable, even if there was a beautiful voting pattern that had free voting and there were no closing of polls and there was no felony disenfranchisement and there was no having the election off cycle so that people couldn't get away from work, that still doesn't give the city managers the right to use the population as a fine base simply to fill a budget hole with the use of police force. And I think that's the ultimate fallback. We can argue there's people are going to debate to the extent voter suppression and all those things happen, but at the end of the day, the actions themselves are inexcusable under any circumstance. And that because the people who would try to vote them out are suppressed in a way that they can't express their voice, guess what happens? This iceberg forms, this grievance accumulates. Trust me, I study insurgencies. They always begin with a legitimate grievance, right? Grievance accumulates, and to the extent you can have outlets that have reform, that's great. But when you have something like a death of, Michael Brown, that specific death, we tend to look at it as well, let's microanalyze the death itself. Let's wait till the lawsuit's settled. Let's let the court do it. But if you're in that community, that's just the very tippy top of this large iceberg of disparate policing, municipal court violations, disparate income levels, drastically different life expectancies, and a voting system which seems designed to prevent you from voting out the people who are oppressing you. So you lose faith and confidence and sort of opt out of the political system. Thanks for watching the video. Hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to follow the InfoMullet, visit us on Facebook or Twitter. And if you'd like notifications when we post new video content, click on the red subscribe button below the video. If you've ever wanted to become a mulleteer and support the InfoMullet, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate the support.